Hey, welcome back to another episode of Ask Matt. This time, the question that was asked of me was not public, but I'm still going to share it. I just won't share when it was asked. So, what was asked of me this week was, why is it the Titan uses programmer in our title, and what does it mean for someone to be lead and principal and apprentice, and how do those things differ from junior and senior? So, it's a really common thing in our industry to talk about an engineer versus developer versus programmer, and what makes somebody junior, what makes somebody mid, or whatever you would call them, and what makes somebody senior. And so we tried those things for a while. Actually, what we tried for a while was to avoid all of those terms. For the longest time, we just said everyone's a developer, and we just kept going with our lives. But what I realized over time was I was giving people responsibilities and expectations that weren't in sync with what everybody else was having expected of them, and paying them the same and giving them the same job title. And that wasn't it didn't have integrity to do that. And so I realized we needed to make a change. So at that point, I took those two people and I called them senior. We created a new role that was called senior, and it worked for a while. But we ran into some of the same problems that everyone runs into with the concept of senior, which is that seniority, how long you've been around, does not actually have a direct correlation with your ability to do those more advanced roles. Sometimes those roles are more programming required. Some of them are more people required. Some of them are could be held by somebody who's less senior than somebody who's not in that role. And so there's a lot of things that are kind of broken about the ways we normally talk about those things. So earlier this year, actually at the end of last year, Dan and I sat down and said, we're going to have a conversation about a new way to do this. And I'd been thinking for a while that I wanted to make a change. I wanted to come up with a different structure. And outside of this particular topic, we were running into limitations of that structure because we had problems like, well, if there's only two of them, then what happens when the company grows, and how many people can move up into this or whatever. So one of the things what we were trying to fix on our own perspective was, how do we ensure that there's an opportunity for people to grow into a position regardless of whether there are already X number of people in that position. But when we were solving that problem, we started running into all these same problems of what's the terminology that you use for people at varying levels, and what's the base level terminology? Is the base level terminology going to be developer or programmer or engineer or whatever else? So choosing to not use engineer made the most sense for us because, first of all, we're all pretty full stack folks, and I think that engineer is something that people often use when they're really interested in legitimizing what they're doing, which is fine. But I think that personally, we think that engineer has a little bit of a vibe that's a little bit different than what we do, and that's a personal thing. I wouldn't tell anybody else you shouldn't call yourself engineers. That was a decision that we made, really just thinking about how we think about ourselves and what we do. But one of the things we did run into was that there are apparently places, including Canada, where you legally cannot call somebody an engineer without certain certifications, and we certainly don't want to be beholden to things like that. That didn't make the decision for us, but I think it tipped our hand on just saying, you know what? Engineer is not really what clicks with our team specifically. And it doesn't mean somebody else shouldn't do it, but that's how we thought about it. And so we really had the majority of our conversation about developer versus programmer. Again, it's really just came down to what was most comfortable for our team. It seemed that developer has a little bit more of a vibe of being focused on somebody who builds websites. And we do a little more than that these days. We build web applications a little bit more. And as we were thinking about really kind of the vibe you get in each of those, programmer made a little bit more sense about, what do you do every day? Do you develop or do you program? And it's an arbitrary distinction. And if we had stayed at developer, it would have been fine. It was really just kind of feeling out the gut of how do we feel when we say each of those words or hear each of those words? And each company, I think, is perfectly fine to make those decisions for themselves because there is no definition other than the potential legal ramifications around using engineer if you're not supposed to in certain places. But outside of that, it really just kind of, to me, this isn't something where I say, clearly everybody should be this, and if they're anything else, they've got it wrong. Like, I'm not looking at companies that use engineer terms and judging them, not looking at companies that use developer terms and judge them. So in terms of the developer, engineer, programmer thing, it was really just about what makes the most sense to us. The senior, junior, lead, all that kind of stuff, the main thing that made us go in the direction that we did was, so we went from having everybody be a developer to having developers, seniors, and juniors. What we have right now is we've got programmers, we've got apprentice programmers, we have programmers, and we have lead programmers, and we have a principal programmer. We did a lot of research in terms of what other terminology outside of senior and junior that other people use in other industries, and it seems that lead and principal are often switched. Sometimes lead is above principal, sometimes the other way around. But in essence, that is a common differentiation that people use. And it made a lot of sense for us because what we particularly ask of our leads is that they can lead a project, that they can lead another developer, they can lead a team. And so that was a really easy one for us because the definition for that is not that they are more senior than somebody else, but that they have the ability to lead both technically and personally. And the principle, I don't exactly know which definition of principle that general concept comes from, but it was really more just kind of like, well, we do have one, and he is kind of over the other things, a little bit, and it is also just the term of the two that's not lead. Lead made the most sense contextually, and so principle just kind of came when he was, fell to Keith. And then in terms of apprentice, we wanted to do a better job of describing what somebody's doing when they're in that context. And an apprentice is somebody who is actively following along, learning from, a master. And so we're not masters, but in apprenticeship, it's, you're focusing on learning from the people around you, whereas juniors know less. And so that made the most, that was a pretty easy one. We interestingly had some early conversations where people said junior feels diminutive. And I don't actually think that that actually reasoning was not something that made me care as much about junior versus senior, because I think that if someone has less experience, it's fine to say this person has less experience. So I'm less concerned about that. I think I'm more concerned about the idea that someone is in that role. We should talk about what our words should work, right? Like this whole concept of integrity. We should use the best words to describe the reason somebody's there. And they're not there because they have less experience, because you could have someone who has less experience but is a prodigy or something like that, and they wouldn't be in that role. So it's not about juniorness or juniority or seniority. It's about what your posture is in relation to the rest of the team and what your capacity is in relation to the rest of the team. And so that's why apprentice makes the most sense, because nobody expects apprentices to be delivering at the same pace or velocity or whatever you'd say as the rest of the team. And so that makes sense. And we also do have the idea that we're rolling around with an intern. But we do think that junior and senior are most useless because the things we're asking of them don't line up with the terminology that we're using. And furthermore, they're such mixed up, complicated terms that someone could be a senior at one company and be maybe not a junior at another, but definitely not be a senior elsewhere. And we ran into that a lot when people are saying, well, I'm a senior at my current job. And I would just say, I don't even know if you're at a mid at our job. You're definitely not at a senior, and you might be in a mid. And that would be an offensive thing to say, and it shouldn't be, because seniority is just this kind of hand-wavy thing. Whereas with lead, I say, are you capable of leading a team at Titan? Yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then that means you're going to be put on the track to eventually be a lead. And the answer is no, then you stay at a mid until you're a point where you're ready for it. And it has nothing to do with what job title you had at your last job or how many years you've been doing this job or anything like that. So yeah, so that's how we think about it, developer versus programmer versus engineer, and that's how we think about lead and principal versus senior and junior. So I hope this helps, and as always, send on more questions, and I'll see you next time.